Knight under shield. Spaghetti is ready. I'm on my way. Marigold's cheerful voice came from the kitchen. Suddenly, outside the window, an air raid siren howled and died down, and it was immediately picked up by others on the other side of the river. Marigold entered the living room with a tray in her hands. If it's too noisy, we'll go downstairs. In the meantime, let's have a quiet lunch, she said with a smile, untying her pink-flowered apron. Marigold was dressed in her favorite yellow print dress, which he liked so much. The orange rays of the sunset fell on the tablecloth through the open windows. Their apartment was on the 7th floor of a big old house on the waterfront. Below, the Thames gleamed silver, shrouded in a light autumn mist. "Sit down, dear," she said. "And look what I have prepared. Is it true that I become a real mistress?" But he did not look at the steaming dish she held in her hands. He looked at Marigold's hair, so soft and golden, and her eyes, full of happiness and love. She was 20 years old, and it was already the 5th month of their marriage. "Well, sit down, please. And what are you staring at? Did I get lipstick on my nose?" "No," he replied, moving closer to the table. "I just love you, and I like to look at you." Suddenly, somewhere nearby, there was a deafening explosion, and after it something collapsed with a heavy roar. "My God!" Marigold exclaimed, jumping up from her chair. "It's quite close." And before he could answer, the silence was broken again by the shrill screech of bombs, the house shook again, and the windows rattled from the impact of the wave. "Faster down!" he shouted. Marigold obediently took her purse. Since the bombings began, she has always been ready. The purse contained money, his letters to her, photographs, face cream, lipstick, and a wedding ring. He took his coat and flashlight, pulled the blankets off the beds, and hurried downstairs with his wife. The descent from the 7th floor was rather difficult for them. His sore legs did not obey well and did not allow them to move at a sufficient speed. But this saved him from mobilization and allowed him to enjoy family happiness, when all his peers had long been at the front. With each new explosion, the glass rattled desperately, and frightened tenants jumped out of all the doors with blankets and feather beds in their hands. The hideout was in the basement. It was a large room with a low vaulted ceiling. A few tiny windows were filled with sandbags. There were sun loungers and cots everywhere. The stubborn old lady who had declared that no German raid would make her leave London was already downstairs, wrapped in a loose lilac dressing gown. Around it lay numerous bundles. In the far corner was a couple of old men who liked to talk about different explosions. Two famous singers were reading from their cots. In another corner, a burly staff captain was angrily battling a sleeping bag that was zipped. The light from a single ceiling light bulb was dimmed by someone's dark handkerchief. The raid was expected to be long and strong. The sandbags muffled the sound of the explosions, but the walls of the building continued to tremble menacingly. Nobody spoke. Gone are the days when jokes and laughter could still be heard in the shelter. 2 nights ago, the house opposite was bombed, and the sappers are still pulling out the dead from under the rubble. At last the bed for Marigold was ready. Smiling, he turned to her, and she laughed. Her happy laugh echoed through the vault, and the angry staff captain gave them a disapproving look. He listened anxiously to the noise of the approaching planes. "Look what an idiot I am," she said. "I still hold the blanket in my hands." Marigold tossed it onto the cot, and the blanket caught fire in a bright spot against the gray tarpaulin. Finally she lay down. He carefully covered her from above, and instead of a pillow, he put his folded overcoat under her head. No one wanted to sleep, but everyone lay quietly. Many read or pretended to read. Somewhere above, heavy planes roared hoarsely, bombs howled, and distant explosions hooted ominously. The shelter was damp and cold. And suddenly, in the silence of the basement, a loud female voice with a strong foreign accent was heard from the corridor. It was as unusual as if someone spoke loudly, for example, in a church. "Thank you. I'll stay here until all this stops." The door opened and a woman entered the room. She was pointed to an empty cot next to Marigold. "This is Mrs. Foster's bed, miss." The girl was immediately embarrassed, realizing that everyone in the room was silent, and quietly sat down on the edge of the cot. "There's no blanket," Marigold whispered. He got up and offered the stranger a folded rug that lay at the head of his bed. "You will freeze," he said. "You are very kind," she replied, smiling. "I came to a friend. She lives upstairs," but suddenly a raid began. "And I decided to stay here for now." The girl smiled again and turned suggested rug. For a second, their hands touched as he helped her place him on the cot. The girl lay down and closed her eyes. A knitted red scarf was wrapped around her head, which almost completely hid her hair. The girl lay motionless. In the dim light, he could still make out her pretty features and wished he had taken a sketchbook with him. There was a strong explosion, then 3 more in a row, closer and closer. The dark figures of people stirred in alarm. Marigold shifted under the covers too, then turned and found his hand. She held it tightly in her cold palm. But her fingers did not tremble. "Darling. Darling," she whispered. "Everything is fine, dear." "No, I'm not afraid," she answered quickly. "I just understand that at any moment I can die, and we have lived so little together and love each other so much." She moved closer to him and rested her head on her husband's shoulder. Her hair smelled like ferns. He kissed her and Marigold smiled and closed her eyes. "Beloved, here we are safe. You know, my love, that we can only die together, right? Therefore, we are not afraid of bombs, right? I love you so much, my dear. No one in the world has ever loved like that. For me, there is no one better than you, and nothing can separate us. You'll never leave me, right? I thank God every day that you don't have the bones in your legs like everyone else, because now they can't take you away from me. Yes, I know you don't like it when I say this, but think of me, dear. What would I do without you?" He hugged her tightly, pulled her to him, kissed her eyelid and gently stroked her hair to calm her down. "Would you be very worried if something happened to me?" she suddenly asked excitedly, ignoring the nearby explosions, which, after a short break, began to shake the basement again. "I could not live without you." Looking at her intently, he answered seriously, "After all, you are my whole life." She breathed a sigh of relief, closed her eyes and fell silent. And so they lay quietly side by side, calm and happy, and the raid continued, and bombs howled through the sky, factories caught fire, churches and bridges collapsed, like weightless houses of cards in the autumn wind. And then Marigold spoke again. "What nationality do you think this girl is?" He tossed and turned and could not figure out what she was asking about, because all his thoughts were about her. "Probably Czech. She is beautiful," he added. "Your direct opposite is white-skinned, dark-haired and thin. And you are so plump, fair and ruddy. It would be nice to paint her portrait in this red scarf." He spoke so quietly that the girl could not hear him, but for some reason she opened her eyes, looked at him and smiled. In the meantime, the roar of the bombers ceased, and suddenly there was complete silence. They flew away. Someone sighed with relief, and jokes about this were heard from everywhere. The shelter began to revitalize. The alarm siren sounded. Marigold was asleep. She was so serene under that flowery pink blanket that he didn't want to wake her up. He noticed that the staff captain had risen and was heading for the exit, and silently moved after him. After the stale basement air, the corridor was fresh and cool. "I want to see how it is up there," said the captain. Yes, and it would be time to have a smoke already. They climbed steep stone steps, passed another corridor, and found themselves in front of the front door. The night fog was cut through by the wandering beams of searchlights. High in the sky, a small red light burned ominously, drifting slowly towards Lambeth. They crossed the embankment, went up to the wide stone parapet and, leaning on it, lit a cigarette, looking thoughtfully at the brilliant surface of the water and the dark silhouettes stationary tugs. Small waves beat rhythmically against the sides of moored boats, and a light night breeze drove a cloying smell of burning over the Thames. Everything seemed to happen at the same time. A hell of a rattle and a roar from above, a heavy blow on the asphalt when they were thrown face down with the captain, and an avalanche of falling debris, disappearing with a wild clang in a cloud of dust. Those fractions of a second seemed like an eternity to him. For them, he managed to feel how the sticky circle of unbearable, mortal horror was closing around him, and along with it, a painful desire to learn more about everything was growing. They jumped up and rushed to the entrance to the basement. In front of them stood the ugly frame of a house with no ceilings or doors, no bells and no stairs. The heavy 7-story building had in a matter of moments become a heap of eerie, smoking ruins, and now blackened in the mist like a huge dead funeral pyre. Suddenly, the whole world was bizarrely distorted and absurdly shifted somewhere. He could not understand anything. Unfamiliar faces seemed familiar, and the porter, with whom he often talked, returning home in the evenings, was now unrecognizably alien and distant. Nothing else mattered, only the rescue team was too slow to work. Don't they know that every minute counts now? After all, there, under the rubble, remained Marigold, and they are simply obliged to save her. But minutes some people were asking him questions, and the white letters on their helmets were forming meaningless words. Ambulances arrived and a stretcher with pillows and blankets was lowered onto the pavement. Again sounded off. As if it mattered now. He talked about something with strangers, then someone offered him brandy, and he prayed as he had never prayed before, calling on Providence for help, offering God everything he possessed in exchange for a living Marigold. At last the crowd moved aside, and the first litter was carried out. The doctor bent over them, and two young nurses began to quietly whisper something to each other. He approached and felt that his legs were weakly giving way. Marigold lay on the stretcher. Dead. There was no blood on his face or clothes. And the hand was still convulsively squeezing the blanket. He leaned down, kissed her hair, and softly called her name. Killed by the shock wave, the doctor said. The ambulance drove closer and the stretcher was placed inside. Then he saw the doctor approach the next victim. Looking at him indifferently, he recognized the girl with the red scarf in the bed. It seemed to him that all the color from her scarf had transferred to her face, which flared up in scarlet fire when it was lit by a flashlight. The girl opened her eyes and screamed pain. He bent down and took her hand, and thin, pale fingers gripped his wrist tightly. She was screaming like a child in great pain. She was the only one left alive, he heard someone's voice. Then he waited while the stretcher was brought into the car. But when he saw that they had already been strengthened and the curtains drawn, for some reason he jumped into the salon. The attendants smiled sympathetically at him. Everything will be all right, the nurse said, mistaking him, obviously, for her husband. Everything else no longer mattered to him. He waited for a long time in the cold lobby of the hospital, and finally he was told that she would live. Then he learned her name and address. He left the hospital in the morning. In the gray light of dawning day, he spotted the unusually bright milkman's car. Time to go home and go to bed. He still has to finish the picture, and the day promises to be sunny, and there will be enough light. He approached the embankment and then only remembered that his house was no more, and Marigold had died. He has no one left. And there is no longer any reason to live. A person finds a furnished room for himself, a person buys the necessary trifles, cigarettes, goes to a department store and chooses a dressing gown and shirts, then stocks up on oil paints, brushes and canvas. He does this with the help of that part of the mind that never suffers from any misfortune. Because it's much easier live with a broken heart than without favorite habits. And only then, when he returns to his room and makes a fire in the fireplace, although it is still very hot outside, when he is left alone with himself, only then does he, like a crippled and sick beast, begin to lick his wounds and listen to the voice of a devastated soul. Friends did not know where he settled. He corresponded with Marigold's parents, but did not meet with them. She was buried in the family crypt in the old London cemetery, where merry well-fed sparrows are always jumping around the graves. He tried many times to draw her from memory, but could not. About 3 months after Marigold's death, he chanced upon the same Czech woman on King's Road. She still wore her red scarf, tied around her head. When he spoke to her, she did not recognize him. Then they met again. He asked her to pose for him and she agreed. She had very few friends in England. She listened carefully to his stories over and over again about how Marigold died. And soon became the only person to whom he could tell everything. And she was not angry with him for talking so long and in such detail about the same thing. He drew her in a red scarf that contrasted with the pallor of her skin and harmonized well with her scarlet lips. From time to time he left the brush and began to talk about Marigold, and then again turned to the canvas and worked with enthusiasm. The work on the portrait took a whole month. At one of the last sessions, she said that she was very tired and cold. The window was open, and the fire in the fireplace was completely out. "I already have hands like ice," she said. He took her hands in his, just like when they carried her on a stretcher from under the rubble of the destroyed house. And she wrapped her thin fingers around his wrists. He kissed her and she stayed with him overnight. She had never loved anyone before. And now she began to belong to him and turned out to be unexpectedly passionate. She never returned to herself. He liked her quietness and her ability to experience strong emotions. They now lived for each other, and 2 months later she announced that they would soon have a child. He was pleased and at the same time, for some reason, a little scared. They immediately got married, and she transferred her things to him: silverware, books, jewelry, everything that she managed to accumulate during her emigration. He could not stand her absence for a single minute, and so he went shopping with her, and in the evenings he took her to the park with him when he wanted to relax after work. When he painted, she sat on the floor by the fire, quiet and serious. And at night during the bombing, he tightly squeezed her in his arms. Once, after the wedding, he again started talking about Marigold and showed his new wife her portraits, which at the time of the tragedy were just in the frame shop and therefore survived. She looked at them with narrowed eyes and remained silent for a long time. When she spoke again, her voice became unexpectedly hard and harsh, though not loud. "You can't sacrifice the living for the dead," she said. "Now you have me, and soon there will be a child. Let's not talk about her anymore. She is the past. Those who die are either lucky or stupid. But in any case, they should not interfere in our lives. Therefore, all this must be burned. She carefully placed the drawings on the fire, and he watched for a long time as they charred, twisted, and turned to dust. Only one thing was important to him now, that she should not die during childbirth, but he never told her about this. She did not die, and he spent many hours next to her and saw how she suffered and moaned, and he could do nothing to help her, looking out from behind the backs of the doctor and midwife. But everything worked out, and a girl was born. As if a mountain fell off his shoulders, and happiness overwhelmed his heart. He tenderly embraced his wife and warmly thanked God. And she, pale and emaciated, did not even try nothing to say, but only smiled, clung to him and wrapped her fingers around his wrist. They bought the baby an antique oak cradle, a pink pillow, and a tiny pink blanket no bigger than a handkerchief. And now, tearing himself away from the canvas, he often glanced at the sweet little face smiling in its sleep. When he finished work, he sat down next to his wife and, clasping her by the shoulders, watched their little one with her with a sense of joy and pride in himself. "I heard a terrible thing today," she said one evening, as they were sitting together, as was their wont, on the floor by the fire. "Yesterday one old cemetery was bombed. The bombs hit right on the graves and most of the dead flew into the air. After the raid, there were solid skeletons everywhere. On the ground, in trees, on telegraph poles. Probably, even Dante himself could not have imagined such a nightmare. Something inside him immediately tightened, and he felt an invisible ice hand clutching at his throat. "What cemetery?" he said barely audibly. She raised her eyebrows and shrugged indifferently. "Don't know. Somewhere in North London." For a fraction of a second, a clear picture of this horror appeared before his eyes. He saw Marigold's body hanging from the bare branches of a tree. Her once his native body, and now mutilated, half-rotten, monstrous, but still recognizable. He shuddered and tried to put the terrible sight out of his mind. This happened 2 weeks later. He had to urgently order a frame from the workshop, and at that time she just ran for shopping in order to quickly do everything and not leave the baby alone for a long time. He was the first to return and, opening the door, saw a girl in a yellow cotton dress by the crib. She silently looked at the child. When he entered, the girl looked back. "Marigold!" he cried out in horror. She didn't have a hat on. Golden hair fell softly over her shoulders, and her face was pale and haggard. What happened?" He almost didn't hear his own voice. "A couple of weeks ago," she said grimly, "our cemetery came under direct fire. Corpses, skeletons, everything was thrown to the surface." Then she faltered, "But fortunately I was not dead yet. In fact, people do not really die at all." She fell silent again and shuddered all over. "Then I looked for you for a long time. So I found out your address and came." She waved her hand around her with a desperate gesture. A room, a baby in a crib, flowers in a vase, an unfinished portrait of a new wife. And all this happened in less than a year, with pain in the voice graduated from Marigold. She looked around again, despair shining in her eyes, and he realized that she was trying to find something familiar, something that had belonged to them, to her. "Do you love her?" Marigold finally asked. He glanced apprehensively at the door. She could be back any minute. He imagined her walking in with some groceries and a bottle of milk. No, she will not say anything, but she will look at him with her burning eyes full of love and smile without opening her lips. "Yes," he said honestly. "I love her." He looked with pain and fear at this unfortunate girl in a yellow dress. He saw her loneliness, her horror, and prayed to the Almighty to send him death and save him from this nightmare. His daughter smiled as she played with her hands. A lock of blonde hair fell over her forehead. And that hair smelled like fern. And then suddenly steps were heard in the corridor. With despair and incomprehensible ease, he rushed to the door and flung it wide. His wife entered the room, loaded with packages and packages. She held a bottle of milk in her hand. "Honey," she said, "I had so many purchases that I did not have time to get you cigarettes." "What happened here?" she suddenly asked, and she trembled all over. "It is so cold here. Like winter." Then she looked at him anxiously. "What's the matter, dear? Is the girl all right?" The baby grunted contentedly as soon as the mother bent over the crib. "Go, please, for cigarettes yourself, and while I cook food." He really needed fresh air now. People, noise, streets. Hurrying out the door, he almost knocked down a cleaner who was washing the stairs. "Have you seen a young lady here, blonde, in a yellow dress?" "She didn't go down?" he asked. The elderly woman wringed out a rag, hung it on the edge of the bucket, and only then answered. "The lady in the yellow dress went upstairs a few minutes ago. I've seen her here before, 2 or 3 times. I thought she was visiting you, because the neighbors have left and their apartment is locked all the time." "Did you see her go downstairs?" "No, sir." "Did she talk to you?" "No. She just walked upstairs and did not even answer me when I told her that it was suddenly very cold." She wiped her wet forehead with her hand. "Now it's hot again. Funny. On a day like this, it suddenly becomes cold, then hot again. Something strange happens." "Strange?" he asked, and the feeling of fear again covered him with a sticky, suffocating wave. The cleaner took a rag, dipped it in the dirty water, and wringed it out slowly. "Even very strange, I would say. They say it's because of some new weapon of Hitler." When he stepped outside, the air was dry and hot. The old newspaperman smiled when he saw him. The girl in the tobacco shop, giving him change, asked how their little girl was feeling. Everything was so simple and natural. Everything except the terrible and inexplicable, which, as he realized with horror, was a real reality in this world.